The scream that tore from Jessica Martinez's throat echoed across the mountain valley as flames engulfed the cabin around her. She could feel the searing heat against her skin, could smell her own flesh burning as wooden beams crashed down around her. The fire had come so suddenly, so violently, that there had been no time to think, no time to plan an escape. Only the desperate instinct to survive drove her forward through the blazing doorway and into the cold mountain night. Her nightgown was ablaze, the fabric melting against her arms and shoulders as she rolled frantically in the snow, trying to extinguish the flames that seemed determined to consume her completely. The pain was beyond description, beyond anything she had ever imagined possible. It felt as though her very soul was being stripped away layer by layer, leaving only raw agony in its wake. When the flames finally died, Jessica lay gasping in the snow, her body racked with tremors that had nothing to do with the cold. The cabin behind her was nothing more than a roaring inferno now, consuming everything she had ever owned, everything that had connected her to the life she once knew. Through the haze of pain and shock, she became aware of footsteps crunching through the snow toward her. Heavy boots, measured and deliberate. A man's voice, rough and deep, cut through the crackling of the flames. "Jesus Christ," the voice said, and she could hear the shock in it, the disbelief. "What the hell happened here?" Jessica tried to speak, tried to explain, but only a strangled whisper emerged from her throat. The man knelt beside her and she caught a glimpse of weathered features, dark hair, eyes that seemed to hold the weight of the mountains themselves. His hands hovered over her burned arms, not quite touching, as if he understood that even the gentlest contact would bring unbearable pain. "We need to get you to a doctor," he said, his voice steady despite the horror of what he was seeing. "There's a settlement about 10 miles down the mountain. I've got a horse." Jessica wanted to tell him that it was too late, that the damage was done and could never be undone. But the words wouldn't come, and darkness was already creeping in around the edges of her vision. The last thing she remembered before unconsciousness claimed her was the feeling of strong arms lifting her from the snow and the warmth of a heavy coat being wrapped around her ruined body. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you were watching from and hype this video in the comments. But that was 6 months ago, 6 months of healing and hiding, of learning to live with skin that would never again be smooth and unmarked. 6 months of avoiding mirrors and covering herself from neck to wrist, no matter how warm the weather became. The settlement of Pine Ridge was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, but large enough that a woman could disappear if she tried hard enough. Jessica had rented a small room above the general store, paying her rent by helping with inventory and bookkeeping. She kept to herself, spoke only when spoken to, and made sure that her sleeves were always long and her collar always high. The children were the worst. They would stare with the unblinking curiosity of the young, whispering among themselves when they thought she couldn't hear. Their mothers would pull them away with apologetic smiles that somehow made everything worse. Dr. Patterson had done what he could. The burns on her arms and shoulders had healed, after a fashion, leaving behind a landscape of raised scars and discolored skin that told the story of that terrible night in painful detail. He had offered to send her to Denver, where specialists might be able to help. But Jessica had refused. What was the point? It was on a Tuesday morning in late spring that she first saw him again. The man who had pulled her from the snow, who had carried her to safety when she would have gladly died rather than live with what she had become. He was standing outside the general store, talking to Mr. Henderson about supplies for his cabin up in the high country. Douglas Johnson, she had learned his name was. A trapper and hunter who lived alone in the mountains, coming down to town only when necessity demanded it. The other men respected him, she had noticed, though they seemed slightly wary of him as well. Jessica ducked back into the shadows of the store, hoping he wouldn't notice her. She wasn't ready for this confrontation, wasn't prepared to see recognition dawn in his eyes followed by the inevitable pity. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. As she tried to slip out the back door, her sleeve caught on a nail protruding from the doorframe. The fabric tore with a soft, ripping sound, exposing several inches of scarred flesh before she could pull it free. She was still struggling with the torn sleeve when she heard his voice behind her. "Excuse me, miss." Jessica froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Slowly, she turned to face him, keeping her eyes fixed on the ground between them. Yes, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I think you dropped this. He was holding out a small leather journal, one that she recognized as her own. She reached for it automatically, forgetting for a moment to keep her scarred arms hidden. Their fingers brushed as he placed the journal in her palm, and she saw his eyes widen slightly as he caught sight of the damaged skin. For a moment, neither of them moved. Jessica waited for the familiar look of revulsion to cross his features, for him to take a step back and find some excuse to leave. Instead, Douglas studied her face with an intensity that made her want to disappear entirely. I know you, he said finally, his voice soft with recognition. You're the woman from the cabin fire. Jessica nodded once curtly and tried to pull her hand away, but Douglas held on gently, his thumb tracing the edge of one of the scars that snaked across her wrist. How are you healing? He asked, and there was genuine concern in his voice. No trace of the disgust she had expected. As well as can be expected, she replied, finally managing to free her hand. Thank you for what you did that night. I never got the chance to properly thank you. Douglas shook his head. No thanks necessary. Anyone would have done the same. But Jessica knew that wasn't true. She had learned in the months since the fire that not everyone was capable of the kind of selfless compassion he had shown. I should go, she said, clutching the journal to her chest. She started to turn away, but his voice stopped her. Wait, Jessica paused, not daring to look back at him. I come to town every few weeks for supplies, Douglas said. If you ever need anything, anything at all, you just have to ask. The kindness in his voice was almost too much to bear. Jessica nodded quickly and hurried away, not trusting herself to speak. She could feel his eyes on her as she walked, but she didn't turn around. The weeks that followed fell into a familiar pattern. Douglas would arrive in town every 2 or 3 weeks, always on a Tuesday or Wednesday morning, and Jessica would watch him from the shadows, telling herself that she was simply curious about the man who had saved her life. She began to notice things about him that others seemed to miss. The way he always paid his bills in full, never asking for credit. The way he treated everyone with the same quiet respect. The way children seemed drawn to him, despite his intimidating size and serious demeanor. It was during his 4th visit that Jessica finally worked up the courage to approach him. She had been helping Mrs. Henderson with inventory when she saw Douglas through the window, loading supplies onto his pack horse. Before she could lose her nerve, Jessica walked outside and approached him. Douglas looked up as she drew near, and she saw surprise flicker across his features. Miss Martinez, he said, touching the brim of his hat. How are you feeling? Better, she replied, though it wasn't entirely true. I wanted to ask you something. Douglas straightened, giving her his full attention. What can I do for you? Jessica hesitated, suddenly aware of how forward she was being. I've been thinking about what happened that night. The fire, I mean. I can't remember much after you found me, but I know you saved my life. I owe you a debt that I can never repay. Douglas shook his head. You don't owe me anything. Yes, I do, Jessica insisted, and I was wondering if there might be some way I could be useful to you. I know you live alone up in the mountains. It must be difficult managing everything by yourself. For a long moment, Douglas didn't respond. He studied her face with those dark, penetrating eyes, as if he were trying to read her thoughts. What exactly are you proposing? And he asked finally. Jessica took a deep breath. I'm proposing that you let me work for you. I can cook and clean, mend clothes, tend to injuries. I'm good with numbers, so I could help you keep track of your trapping records. In exchange, you could provide me with room and board. And why would you want to leave town? Douglas asked. Jessica almost laughed at that. I don't have a life here, she said quietly. I have an existence. There's a difference. Douglas was quiet for so long that Jessica began to think he was going to refuse her request. But then he spoke, his voice thoughtful. It's hard living up there, he said, especially in winter. The isolation can drive a person mad if they're not prepared for it. I'm not afraid of hard work, Jessica replied, and I'm already isolated here. At least in the mountains, I wouldn't have to pretend that I don't see the way people look at me. Something shifted in Douglas's expression at her words. A flicker of understanding, perhaps, or recognition. He nodded slowly. All right, he said, but we do this properly. You'll have your own space, your own privacy. And if you change your mind, if you decide you want to come back to town, I'll bring you back myself. No questions asked. Jessica felt a surge of relief so powerful it made her knees weak. Thank you, she whispered. You won't regret this. Can you be ready to leave it by dawn tomorrow? Jessica nodded eagerly. I'll be ready. The journey up the mountain took most of the day, following trails that seemed to exist more in Douglas's memory than in any physical reality. Jessica rode behind him on a gentle mare he had brought for her, marveling at the way he navigated the treacherous paths with such confidence. Douglas's cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a stream running nearby and a view of the valley that took Jessica's breath away. It was larger than she had expected, built from solid logs and chinked with mud and moss. It's beautiful, Jessica said as she dismounted, her legs shaky from the long ride. Douglas nodded, but she could see him watching her reaction carefully. It's not much, but it's home. Your room is in the back, with its own entrance. He showed her around the cabin with quiet efficiency. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall. Her room was simple but comfortable, with a real bed and even a small window that looked out over the valley. What would you like me to start with? She asked. Douglas considered the question. Are you hungry? It's been a long day, and I imagine you could use a good meal. Jessica realized that she was indeed hungry, hungrier than she had been in months. The mountain air and the prospect of useful work had awakened an appetite she had almost forgotten she possessed. I could cook dinner, she offered, if you show me where everything is. Douglas's kitchen was surprisingly well-stocked, with shelves full of preserved foods, dried herbs, and basic staples. Jessica set to work preparing a simple but hearty meal, aware that Douglas was watching her from his seat by the fireplace. As she worked, she found herself humming softly, a habit she had abandoned after the fire. You have a lovely voice, Douglas said, and Jessica's hand stilled on the knife she was using to chop vegetables. I used to sing, she said quietly. Before. Why did you stop? Jessica was quiet for a long moment. I suppose I felt like I didn't have anything to sing about anymore. Douglas rose from his chair and moved to stand beside her at the work table. Instead of commenting on her scars, which were visible now that she had rolled up her sleeves to work, he picked up a second knife and began helping her with the vegetables. Music isn't just about happiness, he said as he worked. Sometimes it's about working through the sadness, finding a way to make sense of things that don't make sense. Jessica glanced at him sideways. You sound like you speak from experience. Douglas's hands paused in their work. I suppose I do. They finished preparing dinner in companionable silence, and Jessica found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in months. When they sat down to eat, the conversation flowed more easily than she had expected. Douglas told her about the rhythms of mountain life, about the seasonal cycles that governed everything from hunting to gathering firewood. Jessica listened intently, storing away every piece of information that might help her survive in this new environment. As the evening wore on, Jessica found herself studying Douglas's face in the firelight. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and wind, and a scar along his jaw that suggested he had not always lived such a peaceful existence. May I ask you something? Jessica said as they finished their meal. Douglas nodded. Of course, why do you live up here alone? A man like you could have any life he wanted down in the valley. Douglas was quiet for so long that Jessica began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured. I came up here about 5 years ago, he said, after my wife died. Jessica felt her heart clench with sympathy. I'm sorry, I didn't know. Sarah was everything to me, Douglas continued, staring into the fire. We had a little place down in the valley. She got sick one winter, and by the time I could get her to a doctor, it was too late. Pneumonia took her in less than a week. I'm so sorry, Jessica whispered. Douglas shrugged, but she could see the pain that still lingered in his eyes. After she died, I couldn't stand being around people anymore. Everyone wanted to help, wanted to tell me how sorry they were, wanted to fix things that couldn't be fixed, so I came up here. Jessica understood that kind of pain, the desire to escape from well-meaning people who couldn't possibly comprehend the depth of your loss. Do you ever regret it? Living alone, I mean? Sometimes, Douglas admitted, but then I remember how it felt to have people constantly reminding me of what I'd lost, and I think maybe this is better. Jessica nodded. That's why I wanted to come here. In town, I'm always the woman who survived the fire, the one with the scars. People look at me and see a tragedy instead of a person. Douglas turned to look at her directly. Is that how you see yourself? The question caught Jessica off guard. What do you mean? Do you see yourself as a tragedy? As someone defined by what happened to you? Jessica opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. I don't know, she said finally. I suppose I do, sometimes. Douglas leaned forward in his chair. Can I tell you something? Jessica nodded. That night when I found you, when I saw what the fire had done, my first thought wasn't about your injuries. It was about how brave you were. You had just been through hell, but you were still fighting, still trying to survive. That takes a kind of strength that most people never have to discover they possess. Jessica felt tears prick at her eyes. I don't feel strong. Strength isn't about feeling strong, Douglas said gently. It's about continuing to put one foot in front of the other, even when you don't think you can. You've been doing that for months now. Jessica wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. Thank you, she whispered. I needed to hear that. As Jessica prepared for bed in her small room, she reflected on the conversation they had shared. It had been months since anyone had spoken to her as if she were a whole person rather than a collection of scars and sad stories. The days that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm. Jessica rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, while Douglas tended to the animals and checked his traps. After breakfast, he would teach her some new aspect of mountain living: how to preserve meat, how to read weather signs, how to identify edible plants and medicinal herbs. Jessica found herself thriving in ways she hadn't expected. The physical work was demanding but satisfying, and she could feel her body growing stronger with each passing day. More importantly, her mind was healing as well. Without the constant reminder of pitying stares and whispered conversations, she was beginning to remember who she had been before the fire. Douglas proved to be an excellent teacher, patient and thorough without being condescending. He showed her how to set snares for small game, how to track animals by their signs, how to navigate by the stars. You're a natural at this, he told her one afternoon, as she successfully skinned a rabbit he had caught. Most people from town would have given up by now. Jessica looked up from her work, pleased by the compliment. I like having useful skills. In town, I felt like I was just taking up space. You were never just taking up space, Douglas said firmly. But I understand what you mean. There's something satisfying about knowing you can take care of yourself. As the weeks passed, Jessica began to notice changes in Douglas as well. The lines of tension around his eyes seemed to be softening, and she occasionally caught him humming while he worked. It was as if having someone to share his life with, even in this limited way, was awakening parts of himself he had thought were dead. One evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Douglas surprised her by asking about her life before the fire. You mentioned that you used to sing, he said. What else did you do? Jessica set down her mending and considered the question. I taught school, she said, in a little town about 100 miles south of here. I had been there for 3 years when I decided I needed a change of scenery. What kind of change were you looking for? Jessica smiled ruefully. I thought I wanted adventure. I had saved enough money to buy a little cabin and try living on my own for a while. I wanted to write, maybe try my hand at painting. And then the fire happened. Jessica nodded. 3 weeks after I moved in, I never did find out what caused it. Douglas was quiet for a moment. Do you still want to write? The question surprised Jessica. She hadn't thought about writing in months, hadn't considered whether any of her old dreams had survived the fire along with her body. I don't know, she said honestly. I used to write stories, little things about the children I taught and the people I knew. But I'm not sure I have any stories left in me now. Everyone has stories, Douglas said. Sometimes we just need time to figure out how to tell them. The next morning brought the first real test of their partnership. Jessica woke to find Douglas pale and shaky, clearly running a fever. He tried to insist that he was fine, but Jessica could see the way he swayed on his feet and the flush of illness in his cheeks. "You're going back to bed," she said firmly, taking his arm to steady him. "I can't," Douglas protested. "There's too much to do." "The traps can wait one day," Jessica interrupted, "and I can handle the firewood. You taught me how to use the axe, remember?" For the next 3 days, Jessica cared for Douglas with the same gentle efficiency he had shown her on the night of the fire. She made him herbal teas from the plants he had taught her to identify, kept him fed with light broths, and monitored his fever with cool cloths and patient vigilance. On the second day, when his fever was at its highest, Douglas became delirious. He called out for Sarah, his dead wife, speaking to her as if she were in the room with him. Jessica sat beside his bed, holding his hand and speaking in soothing tones. "She's not here, Douglas," Jessica said gently when he asked Sarah to bring him water. "But I'm here. I'll take care of you." Douglas's eyes focused on her face with difficulty. "Jessica?" "Yes, I'm here." "Don't leave," he whispered, his grip on her hand surprisingly strong for someone so ill. "I won't leave," Jessica promised. "I'll stay right here until you're better." On the third morning, Douglas's fever finally broke. Jessica woke to find him sitting up in bed, looking weak but alert, his eyes clear and focused. "How long was I sick?" he asked, his voice hoarse from fever. 3 days, Jessica replied, relief flooding through her. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of elk," Douglas said with a weak smile. "But better, much better." Jessica stood and stretched, working out the kinks from sleeping in the chair. "Are you hungry? I could make you some real food now." "That sounds wonderful," Douglas said. "But first, I want to thank you. You didn't have to take care of me like that." Jessica looked at him in surprise. "Of course I did. What else would I have done? You could have taken the horse and gone back to town, left me to fend for myself." The suggestion was so absurd that Jessica almost laughed. "Why would I do that?" Douglas studied her face for a long moment. "Most people would have. When things get difficult, when someone becomes a burden instead of a help, most people find reasons to leave." Jessica felt a pang of sadness for whatever experiences had taught Douglas to expect abandonment. "I'm not most people," she said simply. "And you're not a burden. You're my friend." Something shifted in Douglas's expression at her words. A warmth that hadn't been there before, a softening around the edges that made him look younger and less guarded. "Friend," he repeated, as if testing the word. "I haven't had one of those in a long time." "Well, you have one now," Jessica said, and she meant it completely. As Douglas recovered his strength over the following days, Jessica noticed a change in their dynamic. The careful politeness that had characterized their early interactions gave way to something more comfortable and natural. Douglas began to share stories about his life before the mountains, and Jessica found herself opening up about her own past. "I always thought I was brave," she confided one evening as they worked together to prepare jerky from a deer Douglas had killed. "But after the fire, I realized how much of my courage had depended on my appearance. When I lost that, I felt like I lost everything." Douglas looked up from his work. "What do you mean?" Jessica hesitated, then decided to be completely honest. "I was considered pretty before, not beautiful maybe, but pretty enough. Men paid attention to me, and I thought that meant I was valuable. When the fire took that away, I didn't know who I was anymore." "And now?" Douglas asked gently. Jessica considered the question. "Now I'm learning that there are other kinds of value. I can take care of myself, and I can take care of others when they need it. I can work hard and learn new things. That has to count for something." Douglas nodded approvingly. "It counts for everything." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching the cabin. Douglas immediately tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle that hung above the fireplace. Visitors were rare in the high country, and unexpected ones were often trouble. "Stay inside," Douglas said quietly, moving toward the window to peer out. Jessica ignored his instruction and joined him at the window. 3 men on horseback were approaching the cabin, and even from a distance she could see that they were not friendly visitors. Their clothes were rough and travel-stained, their faces hard and calculating. "Do you know them?" Jessica whispered. Douglas shook his head grimly. "No, but I know the type. Drifters, probably. Men who take what they want and don't worry about who gets hurt in the process. The three men dismounted and approached the cabin with the swagger of people who were used to intimidating others. The one who seemed to be their leader pounded on the door with his fist. "Open up," he called out. "We know you're in there." Douglas moved to the door but didn't open it. "What do you want?" "Just want to talk, friend," the man replied, his voice carrying a false friendliness that fooled no one. "We're travelers, looking for shelter for the night." "I'm not running a boarding house," Douglas said firmly. "There's a town about 10 miles down the mountain." The man's voice hardened. "Now that's not very neighborly. We've been riding hard all day, and our horses need rest." Jessica could hear the other two men moving around outside, probably positioning themselves at the windows or back door. Her heart was pounding, but she forced herself to think clearly. "There's nothing for you here," Douglas called out, "and move along." The response was immediate and violent. The leader kicked the door hard, testing its strength, while one of the other men smashed a window with the butt of his pistol. Glass scattered across the floor as the man reached through to unlatch the window. Douglas grabbed his rifle and fired a shot through the broken window, not aiming to kill but to warn. The man yelped and pulled his arm back, cursing loudly. "Next one goes through your chest," Douglas shouted. But Jessica could see that they were in serious trouble. The cabin had multiple windows and two doors, and there were three armed men outside. "There's a woman in there with you," one of the men called out, having apparently seen Jessica through the window. "Why don't you send her out to talk?" The crude laughter that followed this suggestion made Jessica's blood run cold. "What do we do?" Jessica whispered. Douglas's jaw was set in grim determination. "We hold them off until they get tired of the game and move on." But even as he spoke, Jessica could smell smoke. The men had apparently decided to try a different approach, and were attempting to smoke them out by setting fire to something against the cabin wall. "Douglas," Jessica said urgently, "they're trying to burn us out." Douglas cursed under his breath and moved to the back door, rifle ready. "We can't stay here. If they set the cabin on fire, we'll have to run for it." Jessica felt panic rising in her throat. Fire. After everything she had survived, was she going to die in another fire? But then she looked at Douglas, saw the determination in his face, and felt her own resolve strengthen. She wasn't the same helpless woman who had stumbled out of a burning cabin 6 months ago. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. Douglas looked at her with surprise and approval. "Can you handle a pistol?" Jessica nodded. She had never fired one, but Douglas had shown her how they worked. Douglas handed her his sidearm, a heavy revolver that felt solid and reassuring in her hands. "It's loaded. Just point and pull the trigger." The smoke was getting thicker now, and Jessica could hear the crackle of flames against the cabin wall. They were going to have to make a run for it. "There's a path that leads down to the stream," Douglas said quietly. "If we can make it that far, we can follow the water and lose them in the dark." Jessica nodded, trying to ignore the way her hands were shaking. "I'm ready." Douglas moved to the back door and slowly lifted the latch. The door swung open to reveal one of the men waiting just outside, his pistol drawn and ready. For a moment, the two men stared at each other in surprise. Douglas fired first, his shot taking the man in the shoulder and spinning him around. The man's return shot went wide, splintering the doorframe next to Jessica's head. She raised her own pistol and fired without thinking, the recoil nearly knocking the gun from her hands. Her shot missed, but it was close enough to send the wounded man scrambling for cover. Douglas grabbed her hand and pulled her out the door, running toward the path that led down to the stream. Behind them, the other two men were shouting and firing wild shots in their direction. The path was treacherous in the darkness, barely visible even to Douglas, who knew it well. Jessica stumbled several times, but Douglas's strong grip kept her upright and moving. They reached the stream, and Douglas immediately led her into the water, wading upstream toward a series of large boulders that would provide cover. They squeezed through an opening between two large rocks and found themselves in a small, cave-like space, hidden from view. Douglas motioned for Jessica to stay low and quiet while he peered out through the rocks, trying to spot their pursuers. For several minutes, they could hear the men searching along the stream, their voices growing more frustrated as they failed to find any trace of their quarry. Finally, the sounds began to fade as the men moved further away. "Are they gone?" Jessica whispered. Douglas held up a hand for silence, listening intently. After another few minutes, he nodded. "I think so, but we can't go back to the cabin tonight. They might be waiting for us." Jessica shivered, whether from cold or fear, she couldn't say. The water had soaked through her clothes, and the mountain air was frigid against her wet skin. Douglas noticed her shivering and moved closer, sharing his body heat. "There's another cabin about 2 miles from here," he said quietly. "An old trapper's shack that I use sometimes. We can spend the night there." They waited another hour before venturing out of their hiding place, moving carefully through the forest toward the abandoned cabin Douglas had mentioned. Jessica's feet were completely numb by the time they reached it. The cabin was small and crude, with only one room and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. But it was shelter, and Douglas quickly set about building a fire while Jessica collapsed onto the single wooden chair. "We need to get you out of those wet clothes," Douglas said as flames began to lick at the kindling. "You'll catch pneumonia if you stay in them." Jessica nodded, but her hands were shaking too badly to manage the buttons on her dress. Douglas hesitated for a moment, then moved to help her, his fingers working quickly and efficiently at the fastenings. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I know this isn't proper, but—" "It's all right," Jessica interrupted. "You're trying to keep me alive." As Douglas helped her out of the wet dress, Jessica became acutely aware of her scars, which were fully visible in the firelight. Douglas draped his coat around her shoulders and helped her move closer to the fire. If he was disturbed by the sight of her scarred skin, he gave no sign of it. "Better?" he asked as the fire began to warm the small space. Jessica nodded, pulling the coat more tightly around herself. "Thank you for everything. You could have left me behind when those men came." Douglas looked at her with something that might have been shock. "Leave you behind? Jessica, I would never do that, never." The intensity in his voice surprised her. "Why not? I'm not your responsibility." Douglas was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but certain. "Maybe I don't owe you anything," and he said, "but I care about you. More than I thought I was capable of caring about anyone again." Jessica felt her heart skip a beat. "Douglas?" "I know it's not my place to say such things," Douglas continued, "but I need you to know that when I look at you, the scars aren't what I see." "What do you see, Wasik?" Jessica asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Douglas turned to look at her directly, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "I see someone who survived something that would have destroyed most people. I see someone who chose to keep living even when living was hard. I see someone who has more courage than most men have in their entire bodies." Jessica felt tears beginning to gather in her eyes. "The scars are still there, Douglas. They always will be." Douglas reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. When she didn't move, he gently touched one of the raised scars that ran along her collarbone. "They're part of your story," he said softly. "They're proof of what you've survived, what you've overcome. They don't make you less beautiful, Jessica. They make you more beautiful because they show the strength that lives inside you." Jessica had never heard anyone speak about her scars that way before. Douglas was the first person to suggest that they might be something other than a tragedy. "I don't know how to believe that," she whispered. "Then let me believe it for both of us," Douglas said, "until you're ready to believe it yourself." Jessica looked into his eyes and saw something there that took her breath away. Not pity, not sympathy, but genuine admiration and affection. "Those men tonight," Jessica said, needing to change the subject before she broke down completely. "Will they come back?" Douglas shook his head. "I doubt it. They were looking for easy prey, and we proved we weren't that." "What about the cabin? Our home?" Douglas smiled at her use of the word home, and Jessica realized that was exactly what the mountain cabin had become to her. "We'll go back in the morning and assess the damage," Douglas said. "If they burned it down, we'll rebuild. If they just damaged it, we'll repair it. Either way, we'll make it right." Jessica nodded, comforted by his confidence. "I'm not ready to go back to town, Douglas. Even if the cabin is gone, I want to stay here with you." "Are you sure it's not going to get any easier?" "I'm sure," Jessica said firmly. "This is where I belong now. With you." Douglas reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing gently over her scarred knuckles. Then we'll face whatever comes together. Dawn broke clear and cold, with frost covering the ground outside the abandoned cabin. Jessica woke to find Douglas already up, standing guard by the window and watching the forest for any signs of their pursuers from the night before. They made their way back to Douglas's cabin slowly, taking a circuitous route that would allow them to approach from an unexpected direction. Jessica's heart sank when she saw the damage the men had done. The cabin itself was still standing, but one wall was badly charred where they had tried to set it on fire. Several windows were broken and the door hung askew on its hinges. It could have been worse, Douglas said, surveying the damage with a practiced eye. The structure is sound. We can fix this. They spent the morning cleaning up the debris and assessing what needed to be repaired. Jessica found herself working alongside Douglas with an efficiency born of their months of partnership. You know, Douglas said as they worked to replace the broken windows, I never asked you what you wanted to do long term, beyond just staying here with me. Jessica paused in her work, considering the question. What do you mean? I mean, do you have other dreams, other things you want to accomplish? The question surprised Jessica. She had been so focused on day-to-day survival that she hadn't really thought about her long-term future. I suppose I haven't thought that far ahead. Douglas set down his hammer and turned to face her fully. Maybe it's time you did. You're a remarkable woman, Jessica. You have skills and intelligence that shouldn't be wasted. Jessica felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that you think about what would make you truly happy. Not just content, not just safe, but genuinely fulfilled. Jessica was quiet for a long moment, turning the question over in her mind. What did she want? I think, she said slowly, I would like to teach again. Not in a formal school necessarily, but there are children in the settlements who have no access to education. I could travel between the communities, maybe spend a few weeks in each place. Douglas nodded approvingly. That's a wonderful idea. You'd be providing something that's desperately needed. But I couldn't do it alone, Jessica continued, the idea taking shape as she spoke. I'd need someone who knows the country who could help me travel safely between settlements. Douglas smiled. Are you offering me a job, Miss Martinez? Jessica felt her cheeks warm. I suppose I am, Mr. Johnson, assuming you'd be interested in such an arrangement. I think I'd be very interested, Douglas said. But first we need to talk about something else. What's that? Douglas moved closer to her, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. Last night, when I thought we might not survive, I realized something. I realized that I've fallen in love with you, Jessica. Completely, irrevocably in love with you. Jessica felt her breath catch in her throat. Douglas, I know it's presumptuous of me, Douglas continued, but I need you to know how I feel, even if you can't return those feelings. Jessica looked into his eyes and saw nothing but sincerity and genuine affection. No pity, no condescension, no attempt to fix or save her. Just love, pure and simple. You're not presumptuous, she said softly. You're brave, braver than I am. What do you mean? Jessica took a deep breath. I mean that I've been afraid to admit to myself that I love you too. I was afraid that if I let myself feel that way, you'd eventually see me the way everyone else does. Douglas reached out and cupped her face gently in his hands. Jessica, listen to me. You are not damaged goods. You are not broken. You are different. Yes, but different in ways that make you stronger, more compassionate, more resilient. Jessica felt tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. How can you be so sure? Because I see you every day, Douglas said. I see how you face challenges without complaining. I see how you care for others even when you're struggling yourself. I see how you've built a new life from nothing. Jessica leaned into his touch, allowing herself to believe for the first time that maybe he was right. Maybe her scars didn't define her. I love you too, she whispered. I love your kindness, your strength, the way you see possibilities where others see only problems. I love that you saved my life. But more than that, I love that you helped me learn how to save myself. Douglas leaned down and kissed her then, gently and reverently, as if she were made of something precious. But Jessica knew she wasn't fragile anymore. She was strong, stronger than she had ever been. When they broke apart, Douglas rested his forehead against hers. So what happens now? Jessica smiled, feeling lighter than she had in months. Now we finish fixing our home. Then we start planning our future. Our real future, together. Over the following weeks, as they repaired the cabin and planned their future together, Jessica began to see herself through Douglas's eyes. She started to notice the strength in her scarred hands, the determination in her voice when she spoke about her plans to teach. The first test of their new partnership came sooner than expected. A family traveling through the mountains stopped at their cabin, seeking shelter for their sick child. The little girl, no more than 6 years old, was burning with fever and barely conscious. "Please," the mother begged, tears streaming down her face. "We don't have anywhere else to go." Jessica didn't hesitate. She invited the family inside and immediately set to work, drawing on everything Douglas had taught her about medicinal plants and fever management. She brewed teas from willow bark, bathed the child with cool water, and monitored her breathing throughout the night. By morning, the child's fever had broken, and she was sitting up asking for food. The parents were overwhelmed with gratitude. "No payment necessary," Jessica said firmly when they offered to pay her. "Just promise me that when you reach the next settlement, you'll tell them there's a teacher up here who's willing to come teach their children." Word spread quickly through the mountain communities, and within a month, Jessica had received 3 invitations to come teach in different settlements. She and Douglas began making plans for their travels. Their first teaching assignment took them to a small mining settlement called Silver Creek, where 23 children between the ages of 5 and 15 had never seen the inside of a classroom. Jessica was nervous as they approached the town, but Douglas's steady presence beside her gave her confidence. The settlement's leader, a gruff man named Tom Bradley, met them at the edge of town. Jessica saw his eyes widen when he noticed her scars, but to his credit, he didn't comment on them. "You're the teacher?" he asked. "I am," Jessica replied, lifting her chin slightly. "Jessica Martinez." As word spread through the settlement that the teacher had arrived, children began to emerge from cabins and mine shafts, their faces bright with curiosity. Jessica felt her heart lift at the sight of them. The first few days were challenging as Jessica worked to assess the children's abilities and create lesson plans. But she found that her experiences had given her patience and creativity she hadn't possessed before. One afternoon, as Jessica was teaching a group of children to read, a new family arrived in Silver Creek. The father took one look at Jessica and pulled his children away from the classroom. "I'm not having my kids taught by some freak," he announced loudly. "Look at her." Jessica felt the familiar sting of rejection, but this time it was different. Instead of crumbling, she felt anger rise up in her chest. "Sir," she said calmly, "I understand that my appearance might be startling to you, but I assure you that I am a qualified teacher with years of experience." Before Jessica could say more, one of her students, a 10-year-old boy named Jimmy, stood up from his desk. "She can teach us lots of things," Jimmy said boldly. "She taught me to read real words, and she knows about plants and animals and how to take care of people when they're sick. She's the smartest person I ever met." Other children began to speak up, defending their teacher with fierce loyalty. Jessica felt tears prick her eyes as she listened to them list her accomplishments, none of which had anything to do with her physical appearance. The man looked around at the hostile faces of the other adults in the room, people who had seen firsthand the positive impact Jessica was having on their children. He mumbled something under his breath and left. "Don't pay him any mind," Tom Bradley said to Jessica afterward. "Some people just can't see past their own ignorance." That night, as Jessica and Douglas settled down in their small cabin at the edge of town, Jessica reflected on the day's events. "I handled that differently than I would have a year ago," she said. "How so?" Douglas asked. "A year ago, that man's words would have devastated me, but today I felt sorry for him instead. Sorry that he was going to deprive his children of an education because of his own prejudices." Douglas smiled. "You've learned to see yourself as you truly are, instead of as you think others see you." "It's taken a long time," Jessica admitted. "But yes, I think I finally understand what you meant when you said my scars make me more beautiful. They're part of my story, part of what makes me who I am. Their success at Silver Creek led to invitations from other settlements, and soon Jessica and Douglas had established a regular circuit that took them to 6 different communities throughout the year. In each place, Jessica found children hungry for knowledge and parents grateful for the education she provided. In the settlement of Pine Valley, she encountered a young girl named Sarah who had been badly burned in a cooking accident. The child was withdrawn and fearful, convinced that she was hideous and that no one would ever love her. Jessica worked patiently with Sarah, sharing her own story and explaining how she had learned to see her scars as symbols of strength rather than shame. "But people stare at me," Sarah whispered one day after class. "Some people will always stare," Jessica said gently. "But that says more about them than it does about you. The people who matter will see who you really are." "How do you... I know." Jessica smiled and pointed to Douglas, who was repairing a broken window across the room. "Because that man over there fell in love with me not in spite of my scars, but because of everything I am, including my scars." By the end of their stay in Pine Valley, Sarah was participating actively in class and had even made friends with some of the other children. It was during one of their winter respites that Douglas surprised Jessica with a proposal. They were sitting by the fire on Christmas Eve, sharing a simple meal and enjoying the peace of their mountain sanctuary. "Jessica," Douglas said suddenly, setting down his coffee cup and turning to face her, "I have something I want to ask you." Douglas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. Jessica's heart began to race as she realized what was happening. "I know we've never talked about marriage," Douglas said, his voice slightly shaky, "but I love you more than I ever thought it was possible to love another person, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band, clearly handmade but beautiful in its simplicity. "I made it myself," Douglas said. "I wanted it to be something that came from me." Jessica stared at the ring, her heart pounding. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Douglas, I want to marry you." Douglas's face broke into a grin as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. They were married the following spring in Silver Creek, with the entire settlement turning out for the celebration. Jessica wore a simple white dress that she had sewn herself, with long sleeves that covered most of her scars, but a neckline that didn't hide them entirely. As they exchanged vows, Jessica thought about how far she had come from the broken woman who had stumbled out of a burning cabin. She was still scarred, would always be scarred, but those scars no longer defined her. "Do you, Jessica, take Douglas to be your husband?" "I do," Jessica said, her voice clear and strong. "Do you, Douglas, take Jessica to be your wife?" "I do," Douglas replied, his eyes never leaving Jessica's face. As Douglas leaned down to kiss her, Jessica felt a completeness she had never experienced before. This was what happiness felt like, she realized. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of love and purpose, and the knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged. The years that followed were filled with purpose and joy. Jessica and Douglas continued their teaching circuit, expanding their reach to include more settlements and even establishing permanent schools in some of the larger communities. Their marriage was tested by the challenges of constant travel and the demands of their work, but it only grew stronger with time. They learned to communicate without words, to anticipate each other's needs, to provide support when the work became difficult. Jessica's scars faded somewhat over the years, becoming less pronounced, but they never disappeared entirely. She learned to see them as Douglas did, as evidence of her strength and resilience. When children in her classes asked about them, she would tell them the story honestly. "Sometimes bad things happen to us," she would say. "Things that change how we look or how we feel about ourselves. But those things don't have to define us. We get to choose what our story means." One autumn afternoon, as they were preparing to leave Pine Valley, a young woman approached Jessica after class. She was perhaps 20 years old, with burns covering one side of her face and neck. "Miss Jessica," the woman said, "I wanted to thank you." "For what, dear?" "For showing me that scars don't have to be the end of the story," the woman replied. "I was in an accident 2 years ago, and I thought my life was over. But watching you, seeing how you've built such a beautiful life, it's given me hope." Jessica felt tears prick her eyes. This was why she did this work, why she and Douglas traveled from settlement to settlement, not just to teach children to read and write, but to show people that healing was possible. "What's your name?" Jessica asked. Emma Sanders. "Well, Emma, let me tell you something. Your scars don't make you less beautiful. They make you more beautiful because they show that you're strong enough to survive whatever life throws at you." Emma smiled, the expression transforming her scarred face into something radiant. "Do you really believe that?" "I know it," Jessica said firmly, "because I lived it." As they rode away from Pine Valley the next morning, Douglas reached over and took Jessica's hand. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking about what you said to that young woman yesterday." "What about it?" "About scars making someone more beautiful. I think you're right, but not just about physical scars. We all have scars of one kind or another, and those scars can make us more beautiful too, if we let them teach us compassion and strength." Jessica nodded thoughtfully. "My physical scars are just the visible ones. We both have invisible scars from losing people we loved, from years of loneliness and pain. And those scars brought us together," Douglas said. "They taught us how to recognize and appreciate the strength in each other." As they rode through the mountain passes, Jessica reflected on the unexpected journey her life had taken. She had been broken by tragedy and remade by love. She had learned that beauty wasn't about perfection, that strength wasn't about avoiding pain, and that the most meaningful life was one spent in service to others. Years passed, and Jessica's reputation as an educator spread beyond the mountain communities. She received letters from teachers in distant cities asking for advice on working with traumatized children. She began writing a book about her experiences, hoping to help others who struggled with self-acceptance after injury or loss. Their book, when it was finally published, became a source of hope for people across the country. Letters poured in from readers who said Jessica's story had changed their lives, had given them the courage to stop hiding and start living again. One letter in particular moved Jessica to tears. It was from a young man who had lost his leg in a mining accident and had been contemplating suicide when he read her book. "Your words saved my life," he wrote. "You helped me understand that I am not defined by what I've lost, but by what I choose to do with what I have left." As they entered their 50s, Jessica and Douglas began to slow down their travels, focusing on training younger teachers to carry on their work. They established a permanent school in Silver Creek and spent more time at their mountain cabin, which had become a retreat for educators and a place of healing. One summer evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, a young couple arrived at their door. The woman was heavily pregnant and bore severe burn scars on her arms and face. "We heard about you," the man said. "My wife, she's been so sad since the accident. She thinks the baby won't love her because of how she looks." Jessica's heart went out to the young woman, remembering her own fears about being worthy of love. She invited them in and spent the evening sharing her story. "Your baby will love you because you're his mother," Jessica told the woman gently. "Children don't see scars the way adults do. They see love and care and protection." The couple stayed for a week, and Jessica watched as the young woman gradually began to believe in herself again. On Jessica's 60th birthday, the communities they had served organized a celebration in her honor. Representatives from dozens of settlements came to Silver Creek, bringing their children and grandchildren to meet the woman who had taught their families. As Jessica stood before the crowd, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the terrified woman who had stumbled out of a burning cabin to this celebration of a life well lived. "When I first came to these mountains," Jessica said, her voice carrying clearly across the crowd, "I thought my life was over. I thought that because I was scarred, I had nothing left to offer the world. But I learned something important." She paused, looking out at the faces before her. "I learned that our scars, whether they're visible or invisible, don't make us less than we were before. They make us more compassionate, more understanding, more appreciative of the beauty and love that exists in this world." The crowd erupted in applause, and Jessica felt Douglas's hand slip into hers. "Thank you," she whispered to him. "For what?" "For teaching me that scars can make someone more beautiful. For showing me that love can grow in the most unexpected places." Douglas squeezed her hand. "Thank you for letting me be part of your story." As the celebration continued around them, Jessica reflected on the words she had written in her book. We are not defined by what happens to us, but by how we choose to respond. Our scars can become sources of strength and beauty if we let them teach us compassion and resilience. Looking out at the crowd of people who had been touched by her story, Jessica knew that her scars had indeed made her more beautiful. Not because they were attractive to look at, but because they had taught her lessons that she could share with others, because they had led her to a love deeper than she had ever imagined possible. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Jessica smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to share her story, to help others see their own scars as symbols of strength rather than shame. In the end, the mountain man had been right. Her scars had made her more beautiful because they had made her more human, more compassionate, more alive to the possibilities that existed even in the darkest moments. And that, Jessica knew, was the most beautiful truth of all.